Peter Collins, Senior Economist with ABS. Thanks for joining us on Flow today.
That's okay. Pleasure to be with you.
Now, there's a pretty comprehensive report ABS has put out today about the winter crop. What's the overall figure looking like compared to, say, records in Australia when it comes to the national winter crop?
Well, nationally, it's a pretty good crop. It's the prospects are for a pretty good crop, I should say. In New South Wales and Queensland and Western Australia, they've had very good opening to the season, and they've had ideal planting conditions. Not so good in some key growing areas of South Australia and Victoria, where it's been a bit drier. Now, in terms of what that all means for production, yields are not expected to be as high as they were last year in places like New South Wales, and so production is expected to be down on last year. Now, just to put that into perspective, last year's crop came within about 1.5 million tonnes of breaking the 2016-17 record, which was a monster. So last year's crop was pretty big.
Yeah.
This one's going to be down on that, but it's still going to be quite a bit above average.
So the overall planting, though, that's pretty high up there in the record in terms of the amount planted.
The actual planting is a record high. Yep. That is certainly the case.
Yep.
But because those yields are not expected to be as high as last year, the record area will yield a pretty big crop, but not a record high crop.
So what's a factor in those plantings, why we're up to a record there, that you can see from figures or reports you've received? Is that pasture? In some cases they're planting up pasture they would otherwise have put for that purpose?
No, look, it's a couple of things. It's when you get a opening break like we've had in some major grain growing areas like in New South Wales and in Western Australia, and you combine that with prices where they are, because prices are quite a bit higher than they were last year, then that gives producers a big incentive to plant as much crop as what they can. And in some places like Western Australia, where sheep numbers are historic lows, they have the land available as well. So it's all of those things working together to provide the big area plant.
Yeah, can we talk about canola? Because there's, I think, if I read the data right, 25% more planted this year than last year. And how much of that would you say is Western Australia as opposed to the eastern states?
You're correct. It is 25% higher than last year. And in Western Australia, there's also a big increase in the canola area planted. Canola in Western Australia is expected to be up 35%, wow. And in that state, it's going to be expected to be record high plantings to canola. Also in New South Wales, there's a fairly sizable increase in the area planted canola. There it's going to be 27% higher. And the main reason for that is, I was talking before about the very favourable seasonal opening to the season in New South Wales and Western Australia, and it's no secret that canola prefers to have good conditions rather than drier conditions, and so that has worked in canola's favour. But also, canola prices are very, very good at the moment, so the margins growers can expect off of canola also provides a very good incentive for planting that crop this year.
Yeah, and that's the prices that have been paid recently, but to what extent can you see that there's an opportunity to lock in future prices for canola planters as well?
Oh, look, that's something that is being done increasingly by producers across many forms of agriculture, including cropping. So, I mean, individual producers will have their own strategies as to maximising their future revenues, and it's certain that some will be doing that.
Now, you mentioned the cropping conditions. We're off to a slow start in those broadcast areas we have in Victoria and South Australia. What will change if that improves? Now, I don't want to draw you into the rainfall we've had the last couple of days, but if that improves, where might that take a crop estimate? If they got back onto sort of a regular sort of planting, does that take it? I mean, we're in record territory in terms of plantings, but would that mean production's potentially hitting a record as well if things improve in SA and Victoria?
Look, it would I don't. It's hard to say, but it's unlikely because to get into record territory, like you go back to 2016-17, and it was pretty much ideal conditions in just about every cropping region around the country. And in that year, every major cropping state on the mainland broke its production record for that year. Now, while the rain we've just had in places like South Australia will certainly improve prospects and will also facilitate further planting, it's hard. It's difficult to see that pushing national production up over the record.
Now, last thing we picked up, because PIRSA, the South Australian agency, released their crop estimates recently as well, and I think I picked up in there they indicated that hay plantings were going to be down somewhat. Is that something you were tracking as well in this winter crop report, is what might be happening with hay?
Look, that does affect our estimates a bit because if land is not being planted to crops for hay production, then that is likely going to be planted to grain production. And that's we have certainly seen that, and that phenomenon is certainly been incorporated into our numbers.
So, sorry, you probably picked up beyond South Australia, perhaps less people are planting hay, is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, Victoria produces a lot of hay as well. And as you're probably aware, there's uncertainty about export markets for hay with export permits into a major market not being renewed. And so when there's uncertainty in markets like that, and people have the opportunity to shift their production, they do. And that's what we're seeing. So we are seeing less area being planted to crops that will produce hay, and that's tending to go into crops for grain production.
Yeah, and I guess if the South Australia-Victoria crop doesn't get up as much as they'd like when it comes to, say, wheat, they might cut that for hay instead, and then maybe see how that goes out there in the market when it would appear that we're going to have a fairly wet or relatively wet winter, so maybe there'll be challenges there getting a good price for that as hay.
Oh, look, it's always an option for people to cut crops planted for grain to hay, but you tend only to see that when conditions have been a bit dodgy and going into the critical spring period where it's important to grain formation. It's uncertain what's going to happen. Or the signals are pointing towards a bad spring. But when producers can see that there's a good chance of a good spring, and their crops are looking okay, they'll tend to take it through to grain because generally you can get more money for a crop taken through to grain rather than cutting it for hay.
Thanks, Peter. Look, appreciate your time today and picking through that data. It's great for our listeners across our broadcast area.
All right, that's okay. My pleasure.